We've all heard about AI, from chatbots that write poems to agents that build websites in seconds. But beneath the hype, a quiet revolution is happening. It's called Causal AI.
Essentially, what it gives us is an ability to really understand cause and effect.
Uncovering what truly matters. And for the pharmaceutical world, this could change everything.
If you really want to get all the way to a final kind of delivery-ready output, it's not necessarily always faster. And so I think there's quite big questions to ask, and really they kind of come down to this central question of how good is good enough.
I'm joined by two people I admire deeply. Moran is a veteran in pharmaceutical commercial strategy, and my second guest today is Ben Phillips. Ben is a thought leader in AI and disruptive technologies. Why is Causal AI emerging now as a game changer in pharma, and what makes it different?
I think it's probably fair to say that the causal inference world has been having a kind of more gradual build over the last kind of 40 years, really, from kind of Judeo Pearl's works right early on. It's very easy to get a strong proof of concept running, especially for these generative-based technologies. Scaling them really is the challenge. The first of all is getting that robustness from the proof of concept that nearly works well enough to one that reliably every single time creates the output that you need is very, very challenging.
What's the goal of transformation overall? It's certainly not just adoption of AI technology. It's not even improvement in efficiency. It's not even improvement in market share. At the end of the day, it's really about improving healthcare.
Really successful organizations are able to embrace a culture of criticizing the idea and assessing the idea rather than the person or the sponsor or the leader.
This isn't a tech demo. This is a conversation about truth, about what happens when we stop guessing and start knowing. So let's dive into it. Ben and John will be hosting a free exclusive workshop in August on how to actually apply Causal AI in your organization. They'll go deeper, share practical tools, and help you get started. If you're interested, just drop in a comment and say I'm in. A few months ago, I found myself staring at a wall of data. Graphs, trends, predictions, all very clever, all very confusing. The numbers told me what was happening, but not why it was happening. And without the why, I was flying blind. In a world where healthcare decisions affect lives and billions of dollars, that's not just frustrating, it's dangerous. We've all heard about AI, from chatbots that write poems to agents that build websites in seconds. But beneath the hype, a quiet revolution is happening. It's called Causal AI. And it's not about predicting the next word in a sentence. It's about discovering cause and effect, uncovering what truly matters. And for the pharmaceutical world, this could change everything. So today we are going deeper, beyond the buzzword, into the space where technology meets real-world strategy. I'm joined by two people I admire deeply. Moran is a veteran in pharmaceutical commercial strategy. He's guided some of the world's largest pharmaceutical companies through transformation, always with a finger on the pulse of what actually works in the real world. And my second guest today is Ben Phillips. Ben is a thought leader in AI and disruptive technologies. He spent his career exploring the bleeding edge of what's possible, and more importantly, what's useful. Together, they represent a rare combination of technical depth and strategic clarity. And today, we are going to talk about how Causal AI is being used to make smarter decisions in healthcare, from accelerating clinical trials to reallocating millions of dollars in commercial spend to where it actually makes a difference. This isn't a tech demo. This is a conversation about truth, about what happens when we stop guessing and start knowing. So let's dive into it. Ben and John, welcome to Drug Diaries.
Thanks, Ashley.
To begin with, Ben and John, may I ask you to introduce yourself to our audience and tell a little bit about your background, please?
Sure, Kaushik. It's a pleasure to be on. It's such an entertaining and informative podcast. You really have great, interesting guests, so we're delighted to be part of that mix. So thank you for that. So John Moran, I'm a managing director within Syneos Consulting, an organization really focused on life sciences and the commercial advisory capability, strategy, and transformation within biopharma and life sciences companies. My background spans 25 plus years now with working first initially on the industry side with companies like Bausch and Lomb and Novartis, but in latter years more in consulting with firms such as Accenture, IQVIA, and now Syneos. I got my start in the kind of OTC healthcare realm. Took a stint as well within consumer packaged goods for a few years, and commercial strategy and the application of analytics and data to finding strategic opportunities has always been a passion of mine. So delighted to share more about leading technologies in this space.
Thank you for the introduction, John. That's a very, very impressive and diverse background. Ben, if you could introduce yourself as well, please.
Thanks, Kaushik. Well, thanks for having me on this today. I mean, I think it's going to be a great discussion. I think it's a great podcast. I'm really looking forward to the topics we're going to discuss today. So my name is Ben Phillips. I have a very different background to John, actually. I spent the first 10 years of my career as a research scientist, working across universities in the UK and the US. Most of that was structural and molecular biology, working a lot on structure-based drug design and a lot of kind of the technical interface between kind of life sciences and structural biology. And I think that kind of drove my interest in some of the kind of approaches to understanding data. And as I was departing the academic world, I moved into kind of a decision point between becoming a data scientist or moving to consulting. I trained as a data scientist briefly before deciding that a consulting route maybe would offer more opportunities for me to grow in the way I wanted to. So I've been with Syneos since then in the consulting practice, working mainly in R&D consulting, and specifically most of the work I do is helping clients understand how to best leverage AI and disruptive technologies and how to actually make that work for them in their organizations, how to actually capture ROI from it, how to deploy it at scale, how to use these technologies effectively. And so, you know, I'm maybe not like a really deep technical expert on causal AI, but I've been working with John on some of the projects we've been doing together, and really looking forward to exploring it a little bit on this podcast.
And Ben
that's
Vermont.
Wow, that's a lot of collective knowledge, experience, and wisdom in the room, and I can't wait to dive into our today's conversation. In a 2023 survey, over 60% of pharma executives said that they struggle to translate predictive analytics into actionable decisions. And that's because most AI models tell us what's likely to happen, but not why it's happening. And that's where causal AI enters the picture. Why is causal AI emerging now as a game changer in pharma, and what makes it different from what we have seen with Gen AI?
Maybe I can jump in on this one with a kind of some early thoughts on this. So I think in a style that's a little different to this language model boom, where everything kind of really kicked off with the public release of ChatGPT 3.0, there was similarly in causal AI a lot of work behind the scenes a long time before that. And I think it's probably fair to say that the causal inference world has been having a kind of more gradual build over the last kind of 40 years, really, from kind of Judeo Pearl's works right early on. And a lot of the underlying computational processes and hardware required to do these complex calculations is very similar to some of those traditional machine learning techniques. So the GPU boom, the innovations in those technologies and those algorithms have still been helpful for causal AI. And so now we're in a position where we can use those causal inference frameworks, but also leverage the underlying ML approaches that still require complex computation and a lot of power. And so they're kind of coming together in a marriage now that's, you know, opening up possibilities that just weren't there before. So I think it's really been more of a kind of gradual transition, and possibly that's why it hasn't quite captured the public imagination the same way. But I think as we'll explore later on, there's a lot of, you know, really exciting things here that are maybe a little bit underrated or flying under the radar slightly in the general community.
And we often hear about ChatGPT and generative AI, but as pharma organizations get more ambitious with tech, we need to separate tools built for generating content from those designed to make strategic decisions. And causal AI sits in the second camp, I guess. Can you help us understand how these fit together?
I think from the commercial angle, they both are establishing their place within the enterprise. Certainly the need to understand causality, what's causing what is the hierarchy of variables as you try to understand what drives brand performance, let's say, very important. We're trying to establish greater precision about that. In the past, we've really looked at perhaps coincidental statistics to be able to figure that aspect out. Now we have capability to see a pattern in data and the many variables that might cause a new patient start or to keep a patient on therapy, whatever the outcome is that the organization is seeking to maximize. With generative AI, you have the ability now to focus that why and how against content to develop a material, messaging, communications that really address the underlying causes of the performance you're seeking to achieve in the market. So the two work hand in hand. I think it's easy to confuse the two, but I think there are different business purposes for both. And it really goes back to looking at a variety of experiments and situations to try both these techniques, both these technologies to see where an organization can generate the most value. Certainly not everyone is going to be successful. And in fact, maybe fewer than half are successful, but a spirit of innovation and trial is really needed to flesh both out to at least operationalize from a commercial standpoint or a customer standpoint. Ben, I'll let you comment as well.
Yeah, absolutely. I think, a lot of thoughts that kind of follow on from those, from you, John. I mean, I think one of the interesting things about these generative models is that, right from the kind of public release of the GPT 3.0, 3.5, these got temperature factors built into them. They're intended not to produce the same results if you give them the same prompt. And so fundamentally, that makes them quite a challenging tool to leverage in such a regulated environment that requires really reproducible outputs. If you have a tool that's intentionally designed to not give you the same result if you give it the same question twice, then working out how you leverage that and how you capture value with it is quite complex. And our existing systems and frameworks aren't necessarily that well suited to doing that. And I think this is really the exact opposite side of the coin with causal AI, where the definition of it is to try and understand at a really robust level exactly what's causing what. So in that aspect, I think they're fundamentally very, very different. And there's a lot of exciting space for leveraging these generative technologies across companies. And I think we'll get a chance to talk about a lot of that later on. But I think this is maybe early on one of the things that is really worth kind of focusing on in this discussion is that really some of the power in these causal approaches is just how robust you can really clarify a meaningful direct relationship between things. Eventually, you end up with something that's very robust, that's reproducible, that gives you a quantitative insight that you can act on. And, I think part of that is why companies have struggled to capture value with these generative tools, because they are very dazzling, they're very exciting when you first see them, and they have this illusion of being able to generate extraordinary value very quickly. But actually operationalizing that is challenging if they can't essentially be adapted to the needs of the business in the way we work currently.
Right. And my follow-up question to that is, where do you think Gen AI has been useful and where it has fallen short?
If I were to look at Gen AI and its capability and where it perhaps hasn't quite met the expectations, it's in the ability to customize and tailor content to specific customer groups, to really find ways to more deeply engage with customers. And I think the promise of that is still there. It's no fault of the technology. I think it's as good as the data that's being leveraged. And I think it's as good as some of the kind of assumptions and structures that go into building those models. I think we're in a learning mode. I do think commercial organizations are working with the technology to find its space, its place in the organization and its actual use case. So I think sharper definition there will contribute to greater usage. But I do agree with your statement, Kaushik, that perhaps it hasn't lived up to what it needs to be at this point. And then one large overhang, of course, is compliance and regulatory issues in terms of, can you get the data that you need to make it really effective and more tailored to those distinct customer audience.
Maybe just a couple of follow-on thoughts as well. I think very much in line with what John was saying. I mean, I think one of so it's broadly understood in industry that these generative solutions are not yet delivering ROI that was expected. And one unique feature of them compared to previous forms of disruptive technology is that generating an impressive looking proof of concept is actually comparatively easy. Because the core capability is kind of in some ways seems so magical, you can actually make a proof of concept that is quite close to what you might want your production ready tool to be able to do. But actually that last 5% is really a lot of work. And at the moment, a lot of the real challenge really across generative AI in industry right now is failing to scale from interesting proof of concept to valuable enterprise tool that's generating real value. And I think there's maybe two things that I think really lie at the heart of this. The first of all is getting that robustness from the proof of concept that nearly works well enough to one that reliably every single time creates the output that you need is very, very challenging. And we're still not yet at the point where we can do that. And I think that ties very much into what John was talking about making sure the content is actually tailored enough to reach to the customers engage. There's a lot of features at the moment. Often we can tell if something's been generated by generative AI. And I think the second point there is that at the moment, we still obviously are operating in a human in the loop context. And I think we will be for a while. And there is actually kind of a kind of operations question of, is having a first draft that's complete and ready, but not quite right, actually that much better in terms of saving time? Because as humans, there are fundamental behavioral traits that mean it's actually quite hard for us to keep focused if something looks very nearly right, but does have fundamental errors. And we also get anchored to the structure of an output. So if we get given a structure from a language model, it's quite difficult for us to unthink that structure and start from the ground up again. And so if you really want to measure how long it takes people to get from zero to the finished output, depending on the document, depending on what the output is, sometimes having a language model generated output first, if you really want to get all the way to a final kind of delivery ready output, is not necessarily always faster. And so I think there's quite big questions to ask. And really they kind of come down to this central question of how good is good enough? Because at the moment we're operating with our proof of concepts in a region where they're pretty good, but very rarely are they actually good enough for the kind of business problem that we need. And I think, J&J's leadership came out recently and said that they found that around 80% of the value that they were seeing with their generative AI projects came from 10 to 15% of their initiatives. And so really there's a couple of key use cases that are actually accounting for the massive majority of value that organizations are realizing. And I think that's basically reflective of the fact that it is quite easy to make proof of concepts that do look like they'd be quite impressive and they're quite close to the final desired tool, but actually that final 5 or 10% is a mammoth amount of work and sometimes at the moment isn't even technically feasible.
And how do you see the evolution of agentic AI reshaping tasks in pharma, and what risks come with that autonomy?
Well, so from my side, I'd be interested to hear John's thoughts on this as well. But I think the first thing to clarify on this is that the word agentic is extraordinarily broad, and different teams, organizations, people, functions are using this word very, very, very differently. And so I think settling on like a tight definition of what we mean by agentic is probably a good place to start. And I'm sure I'm not the person who should be doing that. But broadly speaking, these agentic flows allow you to plug in inputs and provide routes out to outputs, and then provide, essentially a range of different pseudo rational activities that the agent might perform. And so it can do this unsupervised, and it can take a complex task, break it down, and give you complex outputs as a result. Different people are approaching this in different ways. I think some people are modeling these as process flows with inputs that come from various APIs or document sources. Others are doing a natural language to agent where you type out a prompt as you would, for example, when you're speaking to ChatGPT, and then it will devise an approach and it will write all the software itself and then give you the outputs. It's a very, very exciting time for these agentic models. I would imagine that life sciences, and specifically clinical development in life sciences, might be towards the tail end of realizing true value with agentic AI, simply because, exactly to kind of the topics that John was referencing earlier, we're such a regulated industry. The compliance barriers are very high. You've got to be very, very careful. And I think this represents a real challenge for anything that's conducted by an agentic workflow, making sure that you meet the burden of proof for regulators to make sure that, there is clear accountability, that everything has been done correctly, that you're compliant. And so I think there's a lot of excitement around agents, and we can talk about that kind of approach maybe more later on. But yeah, I think my suspicion is we'll see greater progress in agentic workflows in other industries, and also probably in early discovery before we start seeing it in.
Yeah, and on the commercial side, I would agree definitely in Ben's observation around that chasm between 90% and 100%, what we're going for with customers. That is a pretty difficult gap to close at this point. So it may be that other industries kind of make more progress on that, and We evolve in our industry for ways to really make that more meaningful and tailored and more high value to our customer groups. Doesn't mean we shouldn't stop trying, because I think it does hold the promise of terrific efficiency within a commercial organization and the standardization ultimately that legal, MedReg, compliance really wants to have in the development of content, messaging, and materials. So promise is still there, still quite a bit of development to go yet.
Right. Ben and John, for a second, if you were to assume that I have no technical or scientific background, how would you explain causal AI in simpler terms?
Well, maybe if it's simple terms, it's best for me to say it, since that's how I think of it, and only in simple terms. But essentially what it gives us is an ability to really understand cause and effect. I mean, and to some degree, that's a little bit hyped as well. Because truly, if you think about a commercial situation, let's just take the brand decision. Physicians faced with a non-labeled patient has 3 or 4 agent choices to make and decides on one particular agent. Can you really know exactly all the variables that go into that decision process at that time with that patient? It's such a myriad and complex factor. It's almost like trying to predict the stock market. So I think what we're looking for is closer to reality, closer to causation. In other words, ruling out certain variables that perhaps aren't really involved in that decision process. But essentially, it's trying to find that cause and effect between, the various stimulus that organizations provide into the market to see how that's working. I mean, that's just one example, versus the correlation, versus just the coincidental relationship between variables, tasks, promotion types, etc., to have greater clarity and to be able to focus investments more. I think of it in a way to get closer to reality, but not obviously perfectly in sync with reality. And Ben probably has a much more technical explanation of it. But the one piece that's fascinating to me before Ben comments on that is, causal AI is really as good as some of the assumptions you put into it to structure the variables. Of course, you want to account for as many potential drivers of the outcome variable as possible. And so in the traditional R square sense. But what you're trying to do is also structure those variables in a meaningful way so that finding that, as copay costs, affordability for patient goes up, increases, or affordability increases, then, choice and days of therapy go down. You want to rule out certain kind of exogenous factors that are occurring in the data, but you have to really pre-specify that. So there's still quite a bit of involvement from a human perspective. And sorry, Ben, to kind of make that an overly simplistic way to portray it.
No, not at all. I think that sounds like a great explanation to me. And I think maybe 2 just things I would maybe add. So I think maybe the kind of like poster child example for a kind of the value of causal AI and causal inference versus correlative methods is this kind of warm weather and drowning or ice cream situation. And so if you have these 3 variables of the weather gets warmer, and as the weather gets warmer, you see an increased number of sales of ice cream, and you also see an increased number of drownings. And then you might think that possibly the more ice creams you sell, the more people drown. Maybe ice creams make people drown. And obviously this is kind of like a very simple 3 variable model, and it's quite clear to anyone rationally that actually what's happened there is that it's got warmer and more people have gone swimming in the sea or in bodies of water, and that's why they're drowning at a higher rate. And I think this is the power of this technique, is that you can build a structure around variables like that, where like you can build essentially logical rules into it that make it very clear that it doesn't make sense that selling more ice creams would lead to that. And then you can also build structural models around that to then understand how much of a direct causal impact the increased weather has on number of people are drowning versus, maybe it's an Olympic year and a lot of people have watched the swimming on TV and they want to go swimming, but they're not particularly experienced or something like that. And so one of the kind of interesting results of this is that I think people sometimes talk about these causal methods as kind of augmented intelligence rather than artificial intelligence, this kind of other form of AI. And this is because really the domain experts and the input from the human experts is really, really critical in making robust causal models. It's an absolutely critical part of it. And that isn't necessarily as prominent a feature in the traditional correlative machine learning approaches. And so it's very important, even when doing kind of traditional correlative methods, to have hybrid teams where you have subject matter experts as well. But specifically in causal methods, it's really, really critical to have a strong hybrid team that covers all of the different inputs that you're required to end up building a model that ultimately explains the causal relationship between all the variables. And, I think that often leads to a different style of working. I mean, one of the main features of this is that often with these large machine learning based correlative methods, you often start with the data you have and do exploratory data analysis and try and work out where there might be correlations, where there might be patterns. Whereas in these causal projects, what you actually often do is start with the business objective in mind, and then actually you have to kind of build your causal maps out first, and then make sure you have a data enough to try and assess whether or not there are causal relationships there. But because you start by building the structure of the problem rather than start by looking at the data you have, it's quite a different workflow, and it really requires subject matter expertise right from the start.
Correlation doesn't mean causation. We hear that all the time. But in pharma, that distinction is expensive. Could you share an example of where causal AI has led to a better decision than traditional AI would have?
Yeah, I think there's plenty of opportunities to demonstrate that, Kaushik. And, an area that we do a lot of work in is around sales force effectiveness and really understanding the engagement, the quality of interaction between HCP and whether it's a key account manager or institutional sales rep or traditional sales rep and FRM. What we're trying to understand is, what is that interaction look like? What should be some of the improvement drivers? So you might just say traditional, maybe even machine learning based models might look at the frequency of visit. It might look at a certain time period, a count of visits in a certain time period, and it might assign a value of impact to that frequency or that count, if you want to call it a count. But really, when you look more deeply and bring more variables into the equation, where causal AI can really bring a much more finer point to that, is it may just be the message that's being delivered. And it may not just be the fact that there's a personal visit or an interaction. It's more about what was said during that conversation, which has enormous implication for how the brand operates, because you could certainly deliver that message digitally. You could target the right position. You could incorporate that into other role types that are visiting. So there's some efficiency gain, but then there's also the effectiveness gain. So just having greater detail into how individual customers are behaving with the variables available, understanding how markets are behaving, because there's this network effect also that occurs within markets or ecosystems, as well as what the brand or performance drivers are. A lot of opportunity to really go deeper and paint the picture of what's causing the actual behavior.
Right. And I've recently had the chance to read through this case study from Syneos about causal AI and reallocation of investment in cities like Atlanta and Seattle, and how commercial performance varies widely across regions. Are you able to tell us a little bit more about that case study?
Sure. I think what we're looking for is, I described it as network effect. Long-time veterans in the industry may have, recalled a day, maybe it's 10, 15 years ago. I'm kind of dating myself, but the idea that the interaction between customer types, local market ecosystems, payers, health systems, physicians within those health systems, the patients, caregivers, all these different stakeholders come together to actually change how behavior would be intended if it were a single variable or a single customer-oriented model. And that's what we're after now. We were in search of a technology back then to really explain these network effects that do exist in local markets. In other words, the way you approach a given market with a particular promotion channel, a particular tactic, a particular message, it can change very differently and be interpreted and converted very differently within that market, given the mix of customer types and the overall structure of those markets. So this ecosystem-based optimization takes that into account. But sometimes just looking at physician level behavior and trying to establish whether it's causality or correlation it loses the forest from the trees, and or it loses, it loses that definition of those network effects. And what we're about now is using the technology to understand how different stimuli, different investments across the board, and think of it as a cross-functional set of investments are occurring within a given market, and how that changes the dynamic for the brand. How does that really drive overall performance, not just in terms of the brand, but in terms of the effectiveness of role types in those markets? Yeah, we feel like we're at the forefront of understanding local market behavior because causal AI is a tool that we've adopted into that process.
And most AI tools give us an answer, but not the reasoning. And in regulated industries like pharma, explainability isn't just nice to have, it's essential for compliance, cross functional alignment, and trust. And why are traditional machine learning models often black boxes? For instance, if you look at some of the next best action tools available in the market, they provide recommendations, but they don't give the reason behind those recommendations. It's almost like a black box approach. And how does causal AI improve that explainability and interpretability?
I could start because Ben probably has some insight into his project work in that space. But I think one of the reasons NBA is difficult to execute, and perhaps again, as we've said, perhaps not living up to the full potential from an ROI standpoint. But I think that's very situational. And I think what you described, Kaushik, is the case in point. I mean, technology exists, but at the end of the day, human behavior is coexists with that technology. And when a representative gets information that doesn't really sound sensical or logical to him or her in the field, without the support for that, what are the chances they're going to comply with that recommendation and, really take full advantage of what is being recommended? I think there's two factors. I think one, more data is helpful. The early attempts at NBA, I mean, it's kind of very field based in terms of the variables that are being used. And again, not taking into account ecosystems and the role of other stakeholders and accounts within the local market. So there's a limitation on the scope of variables that goes into informing those actions, which is the natural skepticism or hesitation created from the rep, because they know otherwise. They know what's happening within that large idea, whether that action's really possible with that HCP or, something to that effect. And then I think the other factor is, as you described, people want a rationale and a reason for taking action, since it could be counter to how they think about the market. So causal helps show that relationship. Ben talked about that hierarchy of variables. It shows the relationship among variables so that you can understand when there's a positive formulary development within the local market and it's increasing with a certain local health, the access is increasing with a certain local health plan. And there are these number of physicians that exist under that health plan with these type of patients. And then the expected output would be to make those physicians aware and the expected drive from that. So it's just taking it to the point of making it more cogent and rational to take action with, I think.
Yeah, absolutely, John. And I think there's a couple of unique features around causal methods in terms of explainability versus the traditional methods. And so often some of these old traditional methods, when you have very high dimensionality data, can get extremely confusing in explaining why a model has given a specific output specifically to business owners, who are often the ones who actually have to action these, who are often the people who actually have to make changes on the ground in the example that John's talking about. And so, often you get things like dimensionality reduction or principal component analysis, and that will reduce, maybe 50 fields down to 4 or 5 fields that go into your final model. But at that point, it's very abstract, because how do you imagine that? If you think about having your, 50 fields being condensed into 5, it's often very difficult. And you can have things like Sharp coefficients. There's been methods historically to try and explain how much each variable contributes to the recommendation or prediction of these correlative machine learning models, but they're not really explanatory. They just tell you kind of how much each variable contributes to the final weighted output. One of the unique features of these causal approaches is that they start with a diagram. You start with these directed acyclic graphs. You have a diagram of what the causality is, and then you build your structural causal model on top of that. But this diagram, I think, is very intuitive to business leaders. They can see it mapped out. You can see the arrows flowing between the different variables. You can see very clearly to someone what it is that they're looking at and what the causality actually means. And so I think there's a few questions about what explainability really means. And at that level, I think these are, there is a significant explainability advantage for business leaders because they can very clearly see the mapping out of this impact, and it's clear to them why they might act on this decision. I think it is maybe worth noting that a lot of the explainability techniques that are used for traditional correlative machine learning techniques are still used in causal AI models. They're just usually used at the level of one individual causal relationship between two variables in your map. And so the kind of base techniques for explaining causality and then after that explainability are actually, the explainability approaches are in many instances quite similar. But I do think that the general overall model with building this map does increase explainability, especially for business leaders, and also gives a bit more of a trail, because if you have to say to an auditor, why did you make this decision? It is definitely a significant step up and a significant improvement to say, well, this was the structural causal model that we created, and this was the causal relationship we identified, and that is why we then went on to make this decision and take these actions. And that's maybe more relevant on the clinical side than the commercial side, but there is definitely an advantage in terms of explainability, I think.
And Ben, without going too technical, I would love for you to unpack how causal AI models identify variables that are actually driving an outcome, not just correlated with it, especially in complex, messy data environments like clinical trials or HCP engagement. How does causal AI actually work under the hood in simple terms?
Yeah, absolutely, Kaushik. So I think, in fairly simple terms, the way you do this is you identify your problem, your output, and then you essentially list all of the variables you think might have an impact on it or be in any way in the network of variables that might vary with each other or with the final output. You make a big list of them, and then you sit down with your domain experts. And this is a typical workflow. There's lots of sophistication around causal models, and I'm sure domain experts have a much better view of this than me. This is a very high level version of this. You sit down and you create your graph. And this is literally exactly what it says. It's a graph. It's a network where you draw little circles that represent each variable that could change. And then you draw lines between them where you think there would be a causal relationship. Now, there are automated packages that can do this for you, and they do a lot of statistics under the hood to try and propose causal relationships and build the relationships in this network under the hood. Once you have this kind of network, and that network is called a directed acyclic graph. It's directed because the arrows that go between each of the variables are one way only. There has to be a relationship that goes one way, not both ways. And they're acyclic because they can't form loops. There's no loops. Everything has to follow and flow through towards the final output. And so it's basically a really simple map to explain how the variables in your data set impact each other. After that, you can do a lot of complex statistics under the hood. I won't go into the details of it. There's techniques like double machine learning frameworks, all sorts of things that you can use to work out how big a causal impact each one of those variables has on the others and on downstream. And so that is essentially the flow. You build your graph, and then you do a bunch of complex machine learning and or statistics to try and understand the causal impact these variables have on each other. And then you have this map. And then much like other kind of AI and machine learning methods, you go through lots of rounds of testing and robustness checking and sensitivity checking and spike testing and all these sorts of things to make sure that the model is actually robust. And then eventually you have a model where you can actually do something called counterfactual testing, where you can say, well, if we changed one of these variables, what would the final output be? And that's a very big part of causal AI, is this counterfactual kind of testing. And this is the sort of thing that you'd be doing in the models that John's talking about, where what would happen if we changed one of the things that might impact HTTP behavior? How would we expect that to influence the final outcome and other parts of the network? So I think that's like a kind of brief summary of how it works. And there's a lot of technicality under the hood, but obviously probably not the place to go into it today.
Yeah, sure. That was very helpful. John, do you have any additional comments to what Ben said?
Very helpful and useful. And I think when we look at it from a commercial angle, we look at that map and we look at those relationships among the different variables, which generally represent a tactic or an investment type, a spend type. And we see where there are cul-de-sacs, where is spending, where is activity. really not resulting in the cascade to the performance metric that we're studying. So it's very interesting to see these maps. And I think almost as a diagnostic, let's take a brand, or you could even look at it from a market, a local market perspective. When you see these maps and these relationships between tactics variables, you quickly learn where you have opportunity to double down and really drive the performance because you're relatively underspent in some of these key determining variables, and where you can pull back where those type of tactics and variables are not having as much impact or not contributing as much to the downstream outcome. So the visualization is really terrific because it's just at a quick glance, you could see how the brand has the sum total of its strategic choices. How is that now performing against the desired business performance goal? So it's very fascinating.
And as you both rightly said, with so many interdependent variables, such as patient populations, clinical sites, pairs, channels, pharma is a maze of correlation. But causal AI helps us navigate that complexity and answers the most important question: what actually works? So, what makes pharma such a unique, valuable use case for causal AI?
I think you said it. It is the super complex environment that influences business performance. There's a gentleman that started Renaissance Technology, widely known as kind of the father of modern quant trading, Jim Simons, a PhD mathematician, applied probably these type of models. I don't know exactly the type of model, but I love what he said about modeling. Modeling isn't complete reality. It's kind of one version of it, or just a representation of reality. So it leaves a lot of room for adjustment and putting in assumptions and structuring variables and bringing it as much data and kind of complex representation of customers together to see how the data works. Now we really have a tool that really helps us navigate through those different sets or stakeholder representations. So I think our industry is really ripe for this. Certainly any industry will benefit from it. And if you think about healthcare being one of the most complex, I think that's one of the reasons people can be excited about it. I'm excited about it just from the commercial angle, but probably the commercial side is even the lower aspect of what can be done for the benefit of patients from a clinical standpoint.
Yeah, maybe just touching on that as well. I think, ultimately there are probably two key factors on the data side that will have an outsized impact on your success with your causal model. And I think those are coverage and quality. And so if you don't have the data that covers all of the potential impacts on your downstream variable, the more you are missing, the weaker your causal model gets. And that's quite a strong relationship. So at a certain point, it doesn't really become, it's very difficult to make an effective causal model. But similarly, very poor data, very weak data, data with lots of problems, errors, gaps, all of that also makes it very difficult to make a strong, robust version of these models. Even noisy data, all of these things can make it challenging to make robust causal models. In the healthcare and life sciences space, we benefit from a lot of data, first of all. And there's a lot of data in the modern world anyway, but we do have a lot of data in health and life sciences. But critically, because of the regulatory requirements, quite a lot of this data is actually very structured. It has to be quite complete. And maybe to John's point, this is more on the development side rather than the commercial side. But because of the requirements, you actually end up with pretty robust and, by general standards, fairly clean data. So I think that's maybe one of the things that's quite special about healthcare, is that we have a lot of data, and also quite a lot of it in the grand scheme of things, fairly high quality. Not extremely high quality, and data quality is always a challenge in clinical development. But compared to the outside world, I think we sometimes forget how lucky we are and how good we have it.
And one other angle to that thought, Kaushik, too, is, we're very cross-functional, our enterprise, our industry. The enterprise is very cross-functional in terms of the different aims. Every kind of function has a strong contribution to the quality of healthcare, whether it's clinical side, the medical, the market access, the commercial side, brand marketing, etc. And the alignment of these functions has always been a really challenging endeavor for organizations to move in synchronization with their goals for patients and for improving healthcare. And I think the potential exists for things like causal AI, and I won't say just the data and the technology, but the ability to see things more holistically. That's what we're on a mission to do, at least in our practice, is to look more holistically, get functions involved where they can contribute from their unique perspective to that end goal. And causal AI, with the extent of the healthcare data that we have to operate with, helps us see how functions can work together to achieve a common unified goal.
And actually, maybe that kind of is a good moment to touch on something that I think is something we notice when we work with companies that I think is an important determinant of success. And so there's kind of an analogy I use for this, and you'll bear with me, I hope, for a minute while I talk through this. But when I was a child, we used to go on these camping trips with other families, and we'd all take our bicycles on bicycle racks on the back of the cars. And there's a few ways that you can tie your bicycles onto the back of a car using those bungee cords, these elasticated cords. And one of these families would tie the cord on one side of the bike rack, stretch it all the way across all the bikes as far as they could, and then find another attachment point where they could. And they'd do that 2 or 3 times, and they'd have this like network of these bungees stretched all the way they could, but it was actually all quite loose. It was difficult to get it to work. And we were once following one of those, and they hadn't quite got it right, and a load of the bikes fell off the back of the car on the motorway onto the road. And the other way of doing this is to find individual attachment points where one of the frames is meeting the bike rack, and you tie the bungee cord around very tightly in one specific place, essentially using it like a zip tie to tie it on very tightly. As it transpires, that's a much more effective approach to get that to work. I think that you can take lessons from that about how you apply AI, things like causal AI, but also generative AI across your organization. So I think a lot of the most successful organizations will build core capability, central team, essentially a center of excellence, in this instance for causal AI, and they will really understand the base power of the technology. They'll become experts in the fundamental technology, the libraries, the hardware, everything you need to do to get it to work effectively. And then they will work with business owners and business leaders across various functions to identify specific pinpoint locations where this can actually be applied effectively. And you don't try and just generically apply generative AI across your entire end-to-end pipeline. That's how you end up with your bicycles falling on the back of off the back of your car onto the motorway. I think what you do is try and understand these specific instances informed by the technical understanding of your center of excellence team, where they're actually really going to make a difference. And it comes back to that point we spoke about earlier with the kind of J&J leadership saying that 80% of ROI was being driven by 10 to 15% of use cases. Those are those firm points. Those are those tie-on firm attachment points. But I think to get that to work, you need a center of excellence, a core team that are really, really understand the power and the limitations of the technology, and then a very strong cross-functional relationship between them and the business owners. And without that harmony, without that work between both sides, it's very difficult to capture real ROI using these technologies, I think.
I absolutely love that example. That was brilliant. So, Ben, no AI solution is plug and play, especially not in the GXP or compliance heavy space. I would love to hear about the barriers to adoption, like data quality or validation or getting organizational buy-in. What do you think are the biggest barriers to adoption?
Yeah, so I think there's several, and you can break it down. I think maybe we work backwards. Even if you have an absolutely perfect solution that is absolutely ready for prime time, super robust, everything works perfectly, there's still enormous change management barriers often when implementing these sorts of technologies, especially the generative AI-based technologies in organizations. And so I think the rule of thumb that people talk about is that typically for change management, you should budget on normal technology projects where you're installing new disruptive technology. You're looking at $1 to $2 of change management spend for every $1 spent on development costs. And that covers change management and implementation. But actually for these generative solutions, you're looking at more like $2 to $3 spend per $1 spend on development. And that is not because the development is cheaper. That is because the change management and implementation is more expensive. And that is because ultimately this is significantly changing ways of working. And there's a lot of emotional responses to that amongst workforces, which I think is very understandable and should be understood, and we should take time to hear those voices and make sure this works for them. But also some of these technologies can really transform the processes, can really transform the ways of working. So I think ensuring adoption and change management is a really big part of it. But I think even working back from that in terms of barriers, I think it comes back to this conversion rate. So there is extraordinary innovation in pharma and life sciences company. We have very, very intelligent people in the industry. They're doing really, really innovative and exciting things. And we have massive transfer from the big tech companies. We have really, really prime talent in the industry. it's very easy to get a strong proof of concept running, especially for these generative-based technologies. Scaling them really is the challenge. And I think ultimately that really represents, aside from the technical challenges of scaling these generative solutions, which are numerous and significant, I think it really represents a three-way cross-functional working challenge between business owners, IT, and I'm talking about traditional IT here, and then the actual AI developers, which are usually might be nestled in IT as an organizational sense, but culturally are quite different. And I think bringing those three to the table with someone who understands the technical details enough, who understands the security and IT infrastructure requirements enough, and understands the business problem and priorities well enough is really, really challenging. And I think that's where we're spending a lot of our time working with clients. That's where we end up focusing a lot is trying to meet in the middle with those three teams. And if you can get that to work well, then I think you really can accelerate and improve your chances of scaling successfully.
John, you have any comments?
Yes, I would say that, just keeping things focused on the things that, at least from a commercial perspective, that matter most to the brands, the franchises, therapy areas. And that's really trying to go deeper into insights around the specific customers, the local markets, if we're taking a US-based approach, as well as what aspects of the brand are working to meet on those in those particular situations. So I think there is opportunity to really drive those different and enhanced insights that lead to that change in ways of working. Oftentimes, the transformation needs to be driven by a mission to show that we're improving patient care. Like, what's the goal of transformation overall? It's certainly not just adoption of AI technology. It's not even improvement in efficiency. It's not even improvement in market share. At the end of the day, it's really about improving healthcare. And if we could show how the technology is a quantum leap forward for that, I think that helps rally the organization around those new ways of working.
Maybe just one final note on that as well. I think part of this is actually people finding it quite difficult to cull projects that aren't quite working. It can be quite difficult to work out when to cut the cord, and it can be very sensitive. And so I think two key success factors for that are strong leadership, brave leadership, who are confident to say, no, this isn't working. We've set our milestones, we set our KPIs, and we're going to hold the line. And secondly, I think is embracing and fostering a culture in your teams that you critically assess the idea, not the person. This is difficult in organizations where people are individually incentivized. And if your generative AI solution gets deployed at scale, then that improves your chances of promotion through an organization. I think that really successful organizations are able to embrace a culture of criticizing the idea and assessing the idea rather than the person or the sponsor or the leader. I think if you can do that, companies that will succeed in this space will be ones who are brave about cutting projects that ultimately look like they would have promised but don't deliver on it.
Right. Very well said. So Causal AI feels like we are finally getting closer to truth in our data. Looking ahead to 2025 and beyond, what possibilities are you most excited about, whether it's in drug development or commercial models or even patient outcomes?
Yeah, I would just starting with that to really look at the future. I think the most exciting thing is the ability to be more effective. I think it's really changing how brands can engage customers. It's changing the way we invest, we build out brand plans because it's generating insights that we haven't had before. So you can imagine as you're going into a brand planning cycle, and you could see what type of investments are working where more effectively, well beyond what the scope of promotion mix modeling does. But you could see where contracting is the real need in a particular market, where days of therapy is being enhanced by a certain campaign, where the opportunities are to really improve overall performance. It's going to be exciting to be able to respond to that. The new fact set that goes into brand planning can be more robust than ever. So it's going to lead to a lot of creativity. I'm not one to say that AI is really a way to really reduce the need for talented professionals. I actually think it's going to increase the need for creative marketers. It's going to create, just generate demand for how you interpret those insights into driving business performance. So I'm excited for the future because there's new things that marketers can work with and the rest of the functions within the commercial organization as well. There's new insights that are made possible. there's new ways to figure things out. So I think work gets a lot more interesting and challenging when we're tackling and using these type of tools.
Nice. I think following that, maybe I have two things that I'm interested, maybe like a short to medium term kind of potential advance that I think I'm very excited about, and then maybe like a bit more of a kind of middle distance feature that I think would be interesting in the near to mid future. So I think short term, something that I'm very excited about is getting to the point with these agentic flows and that will integrate language models, but will have to rely certainly on more than just that. Being able to reliably and robustly extract and then analyze and run compute over quantitative data extracted from like unstructured or structured text documents. And so I guess what I'm really talking about here is having an agentic interface where you can type a prompt in and say, look through all of the published literature available on clinicaltrials.gov or PubMed or whatever your source is going to be. And through analyzing all of that data, including the graphs, including the percentage that are written in text, please like conduct one specific kind of meta-analysis on this epidemiological question I have, or on this cell biology question I have, or this structure function relationship I have, or this like patient population question I have. And that will give us an extraordinary sensitivity. We'll be in a position where we can pull out and identify insights that would be far too diffuse, spread across a far too large number of very different documents previously. But these tools can pull it all together, conduct quantitative analysis on it, and then give us insights that we'd never had before. And I think this represents a really exciting avenue for target identification. And a lot of things, I think a lot of the features for this are important for early discovery. But I also think the same thing could definitely be applied to the enormous literature body around clinical development, and also probably, I'm sure, John, in many instances in commercial. And so I think in the near term, that's probably what I'm most excited about. In terms of midterm, so I think one of the ideas around this that I've come across that I think is one of the more compelling ones is this idea of transitioning from white box to black box data. And so the idea behind that is that in the near term and the present, companies that are successful are harvesting very, very large amounts of publicly available data that is usually in human readable or human interpretable format. It was collected that way. That's why it was done like that. And these are the algorithms we're talking about today, but also ones that influence us in our daily life, all the Spotify day lists, all of the Netflix recommendation algorithms, all of these sponsored adverts that you get on social media, all these things that influence us in our daily life. Beyond that, there's a next step, which is taking the same approaches, but producing enormous corpuses of your own proprietary data, which is produced experimentally yourselves, but is not publicly available, but you are still using to train and enhance these models with predictive capabilities. Finally, there's this model, which I think has been basically embraced a certain level by Recursion and I think others, where instead you actually start running massive experimental campaigns. Usually this is more of a kind of preclinical thing, but I think this would work in a lot of situations where you are collecting data with a view to it never being human interpretable, but you are collecting enormous, massive amounts of data. And ultimately, you're looking for very, very sensitive detection in these. And so the example in preclinical for this is that you knock out genes or apply drugs to a huge number of cells, and then you literally just take microscope pictures of them, just a clear, transparent, bright field microscope picture of them. It's very, very, very difficult for a human to interpret those images. It'd be very difficult for any human, even with really, really a lot of time, to sit down and get anything interesting out of it. But actually, these are becoming very sensitive techniques to identify new targets and identify potential impacts of new drugs. And I think this black box approach to large data sets might hold, not broad spanning, it will still be confined to certain use cases, but I think there's probably some real mileage in this approach in the kind of medium term in terms of companies gaining a specific foothold or advantage, and especially when it comes to identifying genuinely novel or new discoveries, rather than, for example, improving efficiency or cutting overheads.
Right. That brings us to the end of our today's conversation. And so often in conversations around AI, we get lost in the jargon, the code, the models, the buzzwords. But today felt different. We peeled back the hype and got to the heart of what really matters, why things happen, and not just what happens next. In healthcare, where data influences patients' lives, not just profit margins, that kind of clarity is what I call revolutionary. Ben, thank you for making the complex simple and for painting a picture of what's possible with AI. John, thank you for grounding the conversation in real-world strategy and reminding us that the future belongs to those who act on evidence, not assumptions. And now, a quick opportunity for you, our listeners. Ben and John will be hosting a free exclusive workshop in August on how to actually apply Causal AI in your organization. They'll go deeper, share practical tools, and help you get started. There are limited spaces, and they're offering it on a first-come, first-served basis. If you're interested, just drop in a comment and say I'm in, and Ben and John will make sure you are on the invite list. This has been one of those conversations that stays with you, and it's only the beginning. Thank you for listening, and I'll see you next time on Drug Diaries. Thank you, John and Ben.
Thanks, Kaushik.
Thank you.